So we've got with us Evan Selinger from Rochester Institute of Technology, who will be looking at key lessons from the movements to ban facial recognition technology. And I couldn't think of a better segue post Eusebio Skonavach's talk on the digital ecosystem, looking at potential benefits and harms and how we navigate ourselves through this change and transformation we're going through. But also this morning where we looked at design and implementation of trusted systems that made it safe and reliable to actually transact using artificial intelligence. So I hand it over to you, Evan. Thank you.
Thanks so much for inviting me to speak, Katina. So this talk is going to be a little bit different than the ones I usually give, and I kind of configured it with a sense of what I thought your event would be about. Normally when I talk about banning facial recognition, I speak as a philosophy professor who has written extensively on this and has made the ethical and legal case that this should be our policy response. I thought it would be useful here to step back from that a little bit and to try to sort of articulate what exactly has been happening with this movement, why it's occurring, and what some of the big takeaways are. So more explanatory here than argumentative. Okay. So this was a tweet that I had in October. This was after my long-term collaborator, Woodrow Hartzog, who's a law professor. He and I had an op-ed in the New York Times making the case that facial recognition technology should be banned across actually both corporate and government sectors. And as I note here, we had been making that case for over a year, and we were thrilled that the Times gave us a forum to be able to make it to a broader audience. It was a long and hard road. There was a lot of skepticism along the way. There's still a lot of skepticism. So I want to talk about how the movement has actually grown, maybe a little bit stronger than even I anticipated, and sort of explain where I think things are going. So right now, we're actually at a state where this idea of banning facial recognition technology, which was a theoretical idea when Woody and I first started talking about it, we now actually have 8 different cities in the United States. So they're in 2 states, in California and in Massachusetts, and they've actually passed ordinances that are banning government agents from being able to use facial recognition technology. This should strike anybody as, pretty overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about why. But I also want to add, it's not just these particular outcomes that are significant. We have things like Bernie Sanders, one of the current presidential candidates, who was included in his platform the plan to completely ban facial recognition technology as well.
Yeah.
We're seeing other kinds of more localized environmental movements. For example, proposals to ban facial recognition technology from environments like public housing. Companies like Axon, they've made the decision, at least for now, to ban facial recognition technology in police body cams. There have been bills to ban facial recognition technology in schools. In fact, I'm delighted to say that just a few weeks ago, I partnered up with Evan Greer of the organization Fight for the Future. Fight for the Future has been doing amazing grassroots work in getting campuses to refrain from using facial recognition technology. They're just doing amazing things. So we had a little op-ed on that was connected to a petition and a day of action. And this was building upon Fight for the Future's work in getting concert venues to also be able to make proclamations that they wouldn't be using facial recognition technology. So I want to pull back for a second. So, we are in 2020. I hadn't thought of this issue until very recently. Now, the first time I read about it was this 2004 article by a philosopher named Philip Ray. And Philip was motivated by the fact that in 2001, the Super Bowl had face scanned 100,000 and more people, and this suddenly led to philosophers, or at least a few people like Ray, trying to figure out exactly what are the ethical aspects of using this in public places. Ray consolidated a number of different ideas, put some ideas forward of his own, but I don't really think it caught fire. In other words, if you were to read a paper like that back in 2004, you would never think we would have anything like this. It just still seemed like a set of concerns that were important to think through in terms of privacy and civil liberties, but it didn't feel like this was a pressing issue, or at least something that was going to be nearly as pressing as it's become. Even in 2009, when Helen Nissenbaum co-authored this very influential report, it certainly gave you pause for thought. It absolutely made you wonder about what was going to happen with the future of facial recognition technology. But of all the problems that one was dealing with, this didn't seem the most important threat to focus on. I'll go a little further than that and say, even in 2014, Woody Hartzog and I mentioned him at the beginning of the talk. He was my co-author on a number of papers, including that Times op-ed calling for a ban. We wrote an op-ed in 2014 that, when I look at it from the perspective of today, it really shocks me because we had a different point of view then. In 2014, we were disturbed by an app that was on the market called NameTag, and that app is no longer being used. I don't think the company that created it is still in business. NameTag was scraping images on the internet. It was being marketed to consumers for things like making sure that your new date isn't somebody who's dangerous. And so we were concerned about democratizing facial recognition technology that way, but at the end we said there was good news. And the good news was this. It was that no matter how powerful a facial recognition app is designed to be, it can't get the job done without being connected to a database that links names and faces. I mean, this seems sort of obvious, but the point is that a facial recognition app without a database of images to draw from, it's like a car without gasoline. You can get in, you can buckle your seatbelt, you can fantasize about a final destination, but you're not going to get anywhere. And at the time, it seemed like the corporations that had critical mass level name-face databases, companies like Facebook and LinkedIn, seemed like there was no way they were going to allow that valuable resource to go to any other company. We assumed that if there was going to be data scraping, particularly in bulk, they would be using their vast resources to sort of press for the terms of service violations. And so I think we hoped, or if not believed, that society would have enough time to figure out how to deal with the challenges that facial recognition technology was posing. This seems definitely very quaint today. I mean, so here was an article, front page of the New York Times, not terribly long ago, from Kashmir Hill, and this was her, expose on how Clearview AI is building a database and managing to scrape millions and millions and millions of photos from online platforms. So this optimism that we had in 2014, that this kind of scraping endeavor probably wouldn't be able to fuel a democratization of facial recognition technology, this no longer seems to be the case. Now, along the way, and this is still happening, there's been a lot of skepticism at people who have wanted to ban it. I think the skepticism in some circles has become a bit more muted, but not entirely. The basic ideas go something like this. When it comes to, dual-use technology, this is unheard of. We've had campaigns to ban things like landmines. Can't think of very many good things that they're for, or in the environmental movement to ban things like lead paint. But the idea of banning a dual-use technology, particularly in the United States, which is the context that I'm talking about, seems to be completely anathema to our fundamental ideals of freedom and freedom of choice. People being able to make decisions, and those decisions, so long as they're sort of safeguarded by sort of standard regulatory frameworks, these are the kinds of things that we need to protect. Underlying all of this, of course, is a certain view of technological determinism, a sense that the technology, we use the standard metaphor, the technology is in public use, it's being used in lots of different ways, the genie's out of the bottle, the genie can't be put back in the bottle. All we can do is sort of regulate it, but we absolutely couldn't prohibit it. And you're still getting things, this was an op-ed from like last week, you're still getting the standard talking points that basically say, and attempts to ban it are terrible because terrorism, and these are on par with attempts to ban them are terrible because innovation. In the end, I think the idea that there have been these pushes for bans and successes in having them, they push against three regulatory dogmas. The first one is the sort of libertarian ideal of keep calm and stop the cycle of privacy tech panics. This is the idea that if you look historically, one can make the argument, and a lot of libertarians have, that due to things like status quo bias and other kinds of sort of cognitive biases, people panic when innovation is first exposed to them, they overinflate the threats, but over time they come to calm down and adapt. And social learning kicks in and things aren't as bad as they seem. So being able to push for something like a ban on facial recognition technology is absolutely pushing back on this, and it's suggesting that there is good reason for panic. This isn't a panic that is comparable to all of those other panics that have been deflated, and maybe some of those panics had higher threats than people who push that line of thinking are willing to acknowledge. The other regulatory dogma is the idea that dual-use technology absolutely needs to somehow be circumscribed by cost-benefit analysis. The idea is that so long as there are really good uses for the technology, here we could talk about things like enhancing public safety, making commerce easier, and so on and so forth, that the proper policy response is to find a framework that allows the benefits to be accrued and minimizes the adverse impacts or costs. So the idea of banning a technology suggests that the cost-benefit analysis cannot skew in favor of the benefits. And that's something that really goes against the way that we typically regulate dual-use technology and surveillance technologies. And this leads to the third issue, which is we usually regulate surveillance technologies, particularly from a constitutional perspective, from a tech-neutral perspective. So the idea is that we should figure out if facial recognition poses surveillance threats, what are the Fourth Amendment issues, and how can we update, if updating is necessary, the Fourth Amendment so that it can deal with appropriate forms of surveillance, whether it's facial recognition or gait recognition or other forms of geolocation and metadata. The idea that we need to ban this, that it's posing the most immediate threat, we need to come up with some way of curtailing that while also coming up with a longer-term strategy, that sort of hits hard at this tech-neutral perspective. So I want to pull back from all of this and try to articulate, and I haven't done this before, what I think have been sort of the three main drivers. So again, this is more explanatory. The fact that we've gotten a number of different cities to enact bans, what's made that possible? And I think there are three key issues: timing, simplicity, and federalism. And although there have been a number of organizations, I've already talked about Fight for the Future, a number of different sort of civil liberties and privacy protection organizations that have been very, very important here, I think the ACLU definitely stands out and deserves proper mention. Let's talk about timing. Now, I do think that the U.S. has a healthy distrust of the government, perhaps across the ideological spectrum. However, if we go back to our last president, when President Barack Obama was in office, it was very hard for civil liberties organizations to convince liberals to be concerned about surveillance issues like the NSA. And this was because there was a high degree of trust in the president. But now that Trump is president, liberals are becoming far more anxious about executive power, and they're trusting less how the government might use surveillance technology. It seems like what's happening with the facial recognition movement, the movement to ban it, is that there seem to be spill-off or spillover effects from that broader lack of trust. I think citizens are beginning to realize at the local level that while their current mayor might influence facial recognition technology policy in a positive way, it's entirely possible that future mayors, just like future presidents, have very different agendas. I also think that organizations like the ACLU have been great at getting media attention to the big issues surrounding facial recognition technology. So famously, folks over at the ACLU Northern California, once they were able to show that the product that Amazon was rolling out, a product called Recognition, was able to be configured by using images that were publicly available of people from Congress, and that it could show that there was a significant amount of false matches to criminal mugshots, with errors skewing higher for people of color. This turned out to be a great campaign for putting a face, and I do mean a pun on that, on an issue that otherwise seemed abstract and science fiction-like to most people. In other words, what the ACLU was absolutely brilliant about doing was taking an issue and saying, although people are talking about it at the high level in terms of issues like privacy and threats to civil liberties, they wanted to actually show in a very concrete way how this is and could be used. And I think what that success did is it reinforced an important point here, which is that citizens' political responses are often largely based in emotion. This turned into viral content. It broke through the noise. It got politicians involved. It turned out to be a profound teaching moment for the general public. They became aware for the first time of issues like algorithmic bias and the fact that companies like Amazon, which they tend to think of as simply providing them with consumer services like, books and groceries, were actually in the business of providing facial recognition technology to the government. And so in terms of timing, to break this all down, a broad group of tech experts and activists and scholars all coalesced in calling, at the very least, for a pause button, a moratorium, a temporary ban, emphasizing repeatedly that, at least in the US, there are few and almost no legal restrictions on how the government can use facial recognition technology. There's a perfect storm of problems, and at the same time, the technology is becoming ever more entrenched in government and corporate affairs. And this leads us to the second driver, simplicity. As I opened the talk by noting, the bans that we've seen have been occurring at a city level if we're talking about governance. And this is where I think simplicity has proven to be key. Municipal lawmakers are finding the simplicity of bans appealing because they're ordinarily used to dealing with complex issues that have many different sides, zoning issues and housing matters. But this is an on-off switch. This is either ban it or allow it. And that's because cities are much smaller than the entire nation. Municipal lawmakers, like supervisors, they can form good mental models. They have the ability to grasp the different ways that the local government might use facial recognition technology. It's much harder to develop this rich understanding at the federal level, where a ban might have all kinds of unintended consequences. And so since municipalities can only exert power through a very targeted binary option, reject the technology for government affairs, not the private sector, or accept the status quo, this has made it appealing. They can't engage in more complex and wonky forms of policymaking. That's what state legislators are charged with conducting. And that leads to the third point, which is federalism, the fact that we're seeing this at a local level. The US has a long tradition of federalism, and citywide bans are capitalizing on this. And I think it's crucial to note that the ACLU has long been involved in drafting local surveillance ordinances. And so it was ready to draw on that experience and to help push for facial recognition bans. They played a major role in helping draft and organize the bans in California and in Massachusetts, and they've collaborated with a range of people, including academics like me. The important thing here, I think, is that it's possible that the success of local bans, and therefore federalism, I think it could be functioning as something like a proof of concept, that a more pervasive form of restrictions at the state and maybe even national level are possible. And so by expanding both the political will and imagination, this is the type of outcome that some are finding inspiring and others are finding threatening. And this is just a reminder that part of the points of simplicity which are being drawn home is that there's substantial law enforcement use. There's not a single US federal law that's controlling the use of federal recognition technology, nor has there been a single court case that's limiting the government's use of it. For the most part, the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, doesn't protect what a person knowingly exposes, which is their face, and we can't leave home without it, or reveals the third-party doctrine. We have 3 state laws that are regulating consumer versions of facial recognition technology, and in terms of scraping, we're not going to find much help in standard privacy law or even fair use exemptions to copyright. So overall, there's been a leading number of concerns. I'm not going to go through all of them in the interest of time. Again, I'm just trying to sort of provide a quick overview of where things are going, but these are the big ones. The fact that we have errors and biased results, that there's inadequate, almost non-existent regulation, experiencing disparate harms for vulnerable populations, due process harms, concerns about chilling effects that would impede free association, free speech, and free movement. This would fuel even further over-policing. When it comes to facial characterization, making inferences on people's faces about who they are, what types of behavior they're inclined to do, even how they're thinking. We're having the problems of digital epidermalization and applied junk science. Massive concern about the erosion of obscurity in public, the ability for us to sort of walk around, not quite anonymous, but with enough transaction costs that make it at least fairly difficult for most people to know who we are or understand what we're talking about. Amplifications of surveillance capitalism, and of course, security vulnerabilities. My last sort of points are, so where does this take us? Where are we going from here? What are the big takeaways? And I think there's kind of a new playbook that's been emerging for stopping the resistance. And the idea here is to co-opt the desirability of the very ideal of regulation, and then to start backing bills that preempt statewide bans. So the idea here is, instead of describing regulation as an impediment to business and government interests, all kinds of corporations and politicians are calling for new regulation. But it seems like this push for regulation is an attempt to gain goodwill. So it sounds like you're in favor of palatable outcomes like responsible use, but it's ultimately about steering the regulatory conversation in the direction of conservative change, to have less rather than more meaningfully restrictive rules for organizations like law enforcement. And again, the idea that there would be preemptive clauses in these things that would prevent local communities from being able to enact stronger restrictions than would occur at a larger level. This seems to be the name of the game. And I do think it's interesting here that even when we have companies, you have Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, they're willing to acknowledge that facial recognition technology does present an unprecedented Orwellian risk, but they're able to go from that acknowledgement to the belief that some form of standard regulation will be able to prevent this from happening, rather than technology needing to be banned. And so I think this leads us to sort of needing to push, I think, harder two particular ideals in the future, and these are my concluding thoughts. There's the danger of normalizing facial surveillance. And so one of the key issues is people keep saying, well, why don't we figure out what are the worst threats and what are the least scary threats? Come up with stronger restrictions for the worst threats, and come up with more permissive uses for the things that pose less danger. The problem here is what happens with normalization. The more comfortable we become with any use of facial recognition technology, the more we begin to depend on it, particularly when there's a perfect storm of organizations that are pushing for it, the harder it's going to be to push back on any use. It's all going to seem like the common sense solution for solving a range of problems. And this is why, as we fight for the future, it becomes important to recognize that when organizations like the ACLU talk about what could happen once we have function creep, people might be inclined to dismiss this as just slippery slope conjecture, fallacious thinking. But not every slippery slope is a fallacy. Part of what's going on here is being able to articulate, and we're going to need sort of, I think, stronger accounts of this, why there are good reasons to believe that as the creep functions higher and higher, and spreads, the transaction costs begin to lower, people become habituated. To use the metaphor from the last talk, I guess we are, in a sense, the slowly boiling frog, and when that happens, that is a genuine slippery slope, and the transaction costs and opportunity costs pulling out become exceedingly difficult, if not eventually at a tipping point, impossible. And those are my main ideas. Thank you.